Hello there and welcome back to another episode of the Lazy Girl's Guide to Podcasting. I'm Verity. It is great to have you here on this podcast, and in this channel we talk about, well, everything podcasting really, and how to create, launch, grow, host, run, monetize, make bigger, scale, whatever it is, a brilliant podcast. So without further ado, let's dive into today's topic, where we are talking about, do you have to pay your podcast guests? When searching for podcast guests, this is a common question that might spring up and come to mind of, do podcast guests get paid? And should you be paying your guests to appear on your podcast? It's quite true that in recent years, the popularity of podcasting has just absolutely exploded. And it seems like there are new shows being launched daily. And it seems like everybody and their grandmother is either on a podcast or booked to be on a podcast. But when starting out, budgets can be really tight. And I completely understand that. I started my first podcast with less than $100. Actually, even my second podcast was even less because I already had the microphone. But even if I hadn't, I started that podcast for less than $100 as well. So on that mind, there's a lot to consider, from recording software, equipment, setting up, launching. Everything quickly adds up. So if you're worried or thinking about if you need to cover the cost for a podcast guest as well, then, you might be a little bit stressed and worrying about those costs just adding up even more. Some podcast hosts might believe that paying their guests is necessary, whilst others argue that the exposure and publicity that they offer is enough compensation for the individual's time. So first of all, reasons why podcasters don't pay their guests. If you're already counting the pennies for your podcast production, then you can be reassured. The very vast majority of podcasters do not pay their guests to be interviewed on their podcasts. And most podcast guests will appear 100% for free. Even high-profile guests appearing on podcasts such as Diary of a CEO. Stephen Bartlett has gone on record saying that he has never paid for any of his guests to appear on Diary of a CEO. And that podcast has brought in some ridiculously huge names. So all in, it's quite normal not to pay podcast guests to appear on your show. And there are a few reasons why. So firstly, many podcasters simply can't afford to pay their guests. Podcasting is a relatively low-cost medium, and many hosts are working on tight budgets, as I've already mentioned. They may not have the funds to pay for guest appearances, especially when first starting out. Another reason why podcasters don't pay their guests is that many guests are happy to appear on a podcast for free. For many guests, the exposure and publicity that comes with being a guest on a podcast is more valuable than any monetary compensation they could get. And guests may see appearing on a podcast as an opportunity to promote their business, their brand, and the publicity they receive will be invaluable in that respect. Some podcast hosts believe that paying their guests could actually compromise the integrity of their show. If guests are being paid to appear on a podcast, then that guest may feel obligated to say certain things or promote certain products or talk in favor of the podcast or the podcast host. And some individuals are concerned that this could undermine the authenticity of the show and make it less appealing to the show's audiences. So in which case you might be thinking to yourself, well, if I'm not paying somebody to come on my show, then how can I compensate them in other ways? So one option is to offer guests the opportunity to promote their own brand or business on your show. And this could be giving them a few minutes to talk about their work or products, or allowing them to share links to their website or social media accounts. If you listen to The Confident CEO, this is something that I do all the time when I have guests on my show. After we finished our interview, I always ask questions around how can the audience get in touch with this individual, and I also give them the space to talk about any promos they want to, their newsletter, their masterclasses, whatever it is, so that they can get the most out of the exposure for being on my podcast. You can also promote their appearance on your social media, in your email newsletter. Just really push the fact that this individual was on your podcast so that they are getting the most exposure out of your audience as possible. And don't worry about your audience being small if your audience is small, because you might only have 200 followers on a certain platform. But if 100 of them are interested in that individual being on your podcast, then that is more valuable to your guest than having 10,000 followers and none of them being interested in that person being a guest. One thing I would really urge you to do, though, when you are booking guests for your podcast and they are turning up and giving you their time for free, remember to be flexible. We've all got schedules because, we're all busy in this day and age. But if you're expecting someone to give you their time for free, particularly if they could be making money in that time, you need to be as flexible as possible. So find those mutually convenient times to record a podcast episode. I understand that it can be challenging, particularly if you're in different time zones, but being flexible with your schedule can go a really long way to welcoming a podcast guest who is eager and enthused to guest on your podcast versus someone who is having to record at a really unsociable time or times that just don't fit their schedule. If you want more information and proven strategies for booking the most amazing podcast guests on your podcast, then I would really recommend checking out the guest booking blueprint masterclass. In this masterclass, I'm going to teach you how to elevate your podcast with your dream guests. I've got a workbook in there to help you create the perfect pitch that will land you your dream guests. And I've also included examples of pitches that I have personally written and used and have bagged me some truly amazing guests on my podcast. So do check that out in the show notes. It's called the Guest Booking Blueprint Masterclass. And as I said, the link is in the show notes for you to enroll and check that out. But in conclusion, deciding whether or not to pay your podcast guests is a personal decision that depends on your budget, the value your guests bring to the show, and also expectations of your guests. But if you're worried about the prospect of paying guests, be reassured that the majority of podcast guests do appear for free. Do remember that there are other ways to compensate your guests, such as offering exposure or collaborating in other ways. But ultimately, the most important thing is to be transparent and honest with your guests about what it is that you can offer and what they can expect from appearing on your show. And with the right approach, you can create a successful podcast that offers value to both your guests and your listeners. As ever, I really hope that you have found this useful. If you're interested in enrolling in the guest booking blueprint masterclass, then the link is in the show notes. I would love to see you inside that masterclass. And otherwise, thank you. Please don't forget to hit subscribe to wherever you're listening to this episode. And otherwise, I will see you next time.